lecture of literary criticism. My name is Dr. Fawzi Slisley. I will be talking to you this week about structuralism, a very important movement in literary criticism. It's a movement that appeared in the 20th century and whose work still influences the ways we look at not just literature, but the ways we conduct studies across the humanities and the social studies. Structuralism continues the work of Russian formalism. We looked at Russian formalism in the previous lecture, and we looked at formalism's attempt to establish the field of literary scholarship as a scientific field of study, to establish the autonomy and the independence of literary scholarship, so that it's independent from sociology, psychology, philosophy, or other fields of study, and so that it becomes autonomous, and so that its studies are centered on the work itself and the mechanisms of the work. The way I explain it to my students is usually to think of, for example, in the same way that a mechanic in investigating a car, for example, wants to understand the problems or how the engine is made and only looks at the engine, nothing else. A literary criticism also wants to look at the text and how the text, البنية, the structure of the text, is built together without considerations of anything external. So structuralism takes off from Russian formalism, but it appeared in France in the 1960s. It continues the work of Russian formalism in the sense that it does not seek to interpret literature. It seeks rather to investigate its structures. That's a very important point. It doesn't seek to interpret literature. It seeks to investigate the structures of literature. The most common names associated with structuralism are Roland Barthes, Tsvetan Todorov, Gérard Genette, and A.J. Greimas. These are the most famous. There are many others, but of course these are the most prominent and the most famous. The following lecture looks at one of the most influential contributions of structuralism to the study of literature. And this is Gérard Genette's famous book, Discours du récit, published in Paris in 1972 and translated into English as The Narrative Discourse. The Narrative Discourse, one of the most famous contributions of structuralism to literary scholarship in the 20th century. No doubt, no other book has been so systematic and so thorough in analyzing the structures of literary discourse and of narratology. In fact, the science we call today narratology, which investigates the modalities of narratives and narration, we call it today narratology, owes a great deal to Gérard Genette and to this very book, The Narrative Discourse. In the Narrative Discourse, Genette analyzes three main aspects of the narrative discourse. The lecture is basically going to give you the main points of the book. You can consult it yourself if you want. I will give you, you can find the references. In the references you can find the details, the title and house of publications and all of that. But in the lecture I will provide you with the main ideas of the book. Basically, Genette analyzes three main aspects of the narrative discourse. He analyzes the question of time in the narrative, and he looks at order, duration, and frequency. The second aspect of narrative that he considers is the question of mood. Mood. In traditional literary criticism, there is the question of mood, and in mood, scholarship, traditional criticism usually looks at the question of mimesis versus diegesis. Is the narrative proceeding by imitation, or is it proceeding by narration? And imitation is usually defined as, or is usually used when there is a dramatic discourse being used, direct speech and so on, and narration is usually used. So under mood, Genet looks at the question of mimesis and diegesis, which he puts under the category of distance, and then looks at the category of perspective, or the question who sees. We will go into the details of all of this. The third aspect of the narrative discourse that Gérard Genet looks at is the levels of narrations, or the question of who speaks and how do they speak, and what are the level of speech and narration that exist in narrative in general. So let's start with narrative order and the question of time. Genet makes the point that Russian formalists had already hinted at and established, is that there are two forms of time in the narrative. Any narrative, any storytelling has two times, two forms of times. There is the time of the story. This is the time in which the story happens, or the events narrated happened. So there is the time of the story, and there is the time of the narrative. This is the time in which the story is told. So there is the time in which the story happens, and there is the time in which the story is told. Narrative order for Genet is basically the relation between the sequencing of events in the story and their arrangement in the narrative. So in the story as it happens, usually, it happens as in a sequence of A, B, C, D. These are the events that happen in this story. When it comes to the telling of the story, the narrating, the narrative of the story, that sequencing A, B, C, D might not be chronological. The narration, the telling of the story, might do a D, E, B, A, and then C in the end. So the sequencing might be different. So in that sense, there is the time of the story, which is, the time in which the story happens, chronological development of events, and then there is the time of the narrative, or the time of the telling of the story. And here, the narration might not follow a chronological order. It might begin by the events that happened in the end, and then gives you the events that happened in the middle. It might jump back and forth. So in narrative order, Genet wants to study how the events are, how the narration of the events, how the time of the narrative, the time of the telling of the story organizes the events of the story into a comprehensive narration. A narrator may choose to present the events in the order that they occurred in it. So if the events happened in a sequence of A, B, C, D, a narrator might choose to just tell you the events chronologically as they happened, A, B, C, D, F. Or the narrator can tell you those events out of order. So he might start with D and then goes back to A and then C and then D. And so stories differ in that sense. A detective story, if you want to think of an example, detective stories or murder stories, murder mysteries, usually begin with a murder. They begin with the murder. And then that murder has to be solved. And to solve it, the investigation leads us to a reconstruction of the events preceding the murder. So the story takes us to the events before the murder. So these modalities and changes are basically what Gérard Genet studies under the category of narrative order. Time zero very important thing. Janet has a what he calls time zero, is the point in time in which the narrator is telling his or her story. So that's the time zero. So if you open the book and you're reading a novel, and it says that the father is sitting with his 5 sons, and he says, "Sons, let me tell you a story," right? So the point of time in which the father is sitting with his 5 sons may be 1955, right? So almost 70 years ago, right? That's the time zero of the story. And then the father goes to tell his 5 children a story that happened 30 years before that, say in 1920, right? The time zero of the narrative is the moment in which the father is sitting with his 5 children, telling them a story. That's the time zero. And then the narrative will go back to 1920 to tell these 5 children this and this and this and this happened. Maybe the narrative will jump forward to 1940 or 1950. Maybe even the narrative will jump to 1955 or 1960, right? But essentially, the time zero is it's like the present, the moment that you can call the present of the narrative, the moment in which a narrator is telling the readers or the listeners, here is the story, right? That's the present of the narrative. That present of the narrative is what Gérard Genette calls time zero. Time zero is the time of the narration. It's the time of the narration. It's not the time of the story. It might not be the time of the story. It's the time of the narration. It's the time in which the telling of the story is taking place. The story usually happens before it's being told. Very rarely you find a story that's being told as it happens. There are some films, sometimes, especially in films with camera provides the technology, you see the story as it happens, and the film is telling you the story as it happens. Some fiction, some literature also uses that, but it's not the only type of storytelling. Most of the stories are told after they happen. So the time zero is the time of the telling. It's not the time in which the story happens. And even if the story pretends that it's telling you the story as it happens, it's only a pretense. It's not true. No one can tell you a story as it happened. It's impossible. There is an illusion involved in that. Usually the story happens and then the telling of that story takes place. Even in film, when you put on the TV and there is a film and you see the story in the film happening, it's being told to you as it happens in front of your eyes. But that's also an illusion. That story has happened a long time ago. They are just manipulating the technique to give you the illusion that it is happening in front of your eyes. You are hearing and learning about it as it happens. That is an illusion. So keep in mind the time zero is the time of the narrative. It's not the time of the story. So basically, in investigating order, what he calls order, meaning the order of the time in the narrative, how the narrative organizes the time, the sequencing of the events. There is irregularities. If the story is simply chronological, that's simple. There is no problem there. So the time of the story tries to match the time of the narrative tries to match the time of the story, right? The story happens A, B, C, D. The narrative tries to reproduce that chronological order A, B, C, D. But most serious literature plays with the time. It creates suspense, it creates expectations, it creates false flags, it creates all sorts of interesting atmospheres, and allows the writer and the narrator to use the medium of storytelling or the medium of writing more fully. So it becomes interesting when there is irregularities in the time. Those irregularities, Gérard Genette calls them anachronies. Anachronies. And anachronies happen whenever a narrative stops the chronological order in order to bring events or information from the past of the time zero or from the future of the time zero. So if we go back to our example, the father with his 5 children in 1950 telling them a story, anachronies would be, and he's telling them a story about that happened in 1930. They are sitting in 1950, he is telling them a story that happened in 1930. So he's narrating the story. Anytime the chronological order stops and the father goes to the past, for example, 1927, 3 years before, right, to bring either an incident or a piece of information, or anytime he jumps to the future, for example, he goes to 1937, right, 7 years in the future to bring some piece of information, or, you know, anytime that movement happens towards the past or towards the future, those irregularities in time are called anachronies. And Genette says there is 2 types of anachronies. There is an anachrony towards the past, and there is an anachrony towards the future. The anachronies that bring information from the past are called analepses. Analepses. They are the anachronies that bring incidents or informations from the future are called prolepses. Prolepses. So analepses towards the past, prolepses when information is brought from the future, brought back to the time of the narration, to the time zero. To give you an example, it might be just a simple sentence in a text, in a novel or a play or a poem. For example, I'm just giving you a fictitious example. I woke up in good mood this morning. In my mind were memories of my childhood when I was running in the fields with my friends after school, right? I woke up in a good mood this morning, right? So what's the time zero here? Is it now it's 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock? No, the time zero of this narrative is this morning, when I woke up in a good mood. I woke up in a good mood this morning. That's the time zero. When I woke up in a good mood this morning, in my mind were memories of my childhood, right? Here is an analepsis, right? It's an anachrony, because it doesn't go from like waking up at 8 in the morning. It doesn't tell you what happens at 8:30. It takes you to my childhood, right? 30, 40 years ago, to the past, to bring a piece of information. So this irregularity is called an anachrony. Anachrony. And because it is an irregularity that moves to the past to get information from the past, we call it an analepsis. An analepsis. An example of a prolepsis, you know, that seeks information from the future, again, this is a completely fictitious problem. How will my travel to Europe affect me? My relationship with my family and friends will never be the same again. This is what will make me later difficult to live with, right? This is a simple example. How will my travel to Europe affect me, right? So here I am telling a story about my travel to Europe. And before I begin the story of what happens to me in Europe, I say, well, how will these travels affect me in the future? My relationship with my family and friends will never be the same again. When? In the future. After I go to Europe and travel, that travel will affect my relationship with my family. This is what will make me later in the future difficult to live with. So this is an irregularity again in the chronology of the story, right? Because the story isn't progressing chronologically, it is jumping ahead to the future. It's an irregularity, so in that sense it's an anachrony, and because it's an irregularity that gets information from the future, we call it a prolepsis. Very simple, really. Anachronies are irregularities. When they go to the past to get information, we call them analepses. When they go to the future to get information, we call them prolepses. There is a second level to this. When the anachrony, for example, I get up in the morning and in my mind were memories of my childhood, right? So here I am. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm telling you a story that begins in the morning, at 8 in the morning. I get up in the morning, that's the time zero, right? And in my mind were memories of my childhood. So it's an analepsis towards the past. And when I make this movement to the past, how much time will I cover? How much time from the past will I cover? Will I tell you about what those memories of a specific summer, of a specific year, of a specific experience, of a specific friendship, right? How much time from the past will I cover? Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that when the time irregularity makes a movement towards the past or a movement towards the future, the jump is called the reach. And the amount of time that it covers is called the extent. So you can say this is an analepsis that has a reach of 20 years and it has an extent of 2 months because it covers 2 months. It has a reach of 20 years because it goes back 20 years back in the past and it covers 2 months of time. This is what happens in those 2 months I was on holiday, right? 20 years ago. So that's the reach. What it covers is the extent. Jeannette explains it in the narrative discourse. He says that an anachrony can reach into the past or the future, either more or less far from the present moment, meaning the present moment of the narration, that is from the moment in the story when the narrative was interrupted to make room for the anachrony, either towards the past or the present. This temporal distance we will name the anachrony's reach, right? It goes back 30 years. How long is the reach? It's 30 years. The anachrony itself can also cover a duration of story that is more or less long. It can be a day, 2 months, 3 months, a year, it depends. We will call that the extent. These are the concepts basically. What's the function of anachronies? Well, anachronies serve a few functions in a narrative. Analepses, for example, often take on an explanatory role. They explain something by giving you information from the past. They fillers. They are fillers. They fill a gap in knowledge that we don't have. Oh, by the way, this is what happened 15 years ago. And it fills a gap in the narrative. Prolepsis, moves towards the future, can arouse the reader's curiosity by partially revealing facts that will surface later, right? Like a hint, right? So it creates suspense or arouse curiosity. These breaks in chronology may also be used to disrupt the classical novel's linear narrative. Classical narratives are linear, chronological. Modern narrative tries to break that linearity, that chronology. So these anachronies serve to break that linearity. So more or less, this is the important thing in order, as far as order of the narrative, time and order in the narrative. The other important aspect that Genet deals with is the narrative mood. Traditionally, people understand with mood the question of mimesis and diegesis, the question of showing and telling. If the narrative proceeds by mimesis, by imitation, we say that the narrative is showing the events. If the narrative is proceeding by narration, by narrative, we would say that the narrative is telling the story. Since the function of narrative, and this is something very important contribution that Genet makes, and a question that's still misunderstood today. Since the function of narrative, he says, is not to give an order. When you read the book is not there to give you an order. When you read a novel, when you read it, the function of a novel is not to give you an order. It's not to express a wish, right? It's not there to state a condition, right? But simply to tell a story, and therefore to report facts, whether they're real or fictitious. Then the indicative is the only mood. The only mood in literature that's possible is the indicative. It cannot have an imperative. Literature or a novel cannot be written in the imperative. I mean, probably some, modern literature tries that, but it's an illusion. There is an illusion there. The only mood possible in literature is the indicative, because it's telling you a story. In that sense, because of this, Genet says all narrative is necessarily a diegesis. It's a form of telling. Narrative tells. It doesn't show. It just tells. It can only achieve an illusion of mimesis, an illusion of showing, right? By making the story real, alive, or vivid, right? No narrative can show or imitate the story it tells. All it can do is tell it in a manner that can try to be detailed, precise, alive, and in that way give more or less the illusion of mimesis, the illusion of showing, the illusion of imitation. Narration, oral or written, is a fact of language. Narration is something that has to do with language. And language signifies but does not imitate. Language signifies only. It does not imitate. Here Genet is really solving what in Western culture has been a 2,000-year mystery. Because for 2,000 years, Western literature assumes that literature imitates reality, imitates the classics, imitates the Greeks, imitates the Romans, imitates nature, imitates ideals. All sorts of imitation is everywhere across Western culture. What Genet is telling us is that imitation is impossible, because language signifies, but it doesn't imitate. All it can do is tell a story vividly, precisely, make it alive, and give you thereby a more or less close insight into the events. Mimesis for Genet is a form of diegesis. Mimesis is a form of diegesis. Showing is only a form of telling, right? It's only one form of telling. Showing is only a form of telling. it is more accurate to study the relationship of the narrative to the information it presents under the headings of distance and perspective. If we want to be more accurate and more precise, Genet says, we should study the relationship, the closeness of the narrative to the event. How close is the narrative of the event? And here he says there is two headings. There is a question of distance and there is a question of perspective. So this is how Genet in a way tells us that the question of mimesis diegesis is a false question. If we want to study the narrative mood, we shouldn't look into the question of mimesis and diegesis. We should look into the question of distance and perspective. Well, what does distance and what does perspective mean? Narrative distance. Since the only imitation possible in literature, is the imitation of words. The only thing language can imitate are other words. That's it. Words cannot imitate events. They can signify them. They can represent them. They can capture them, right? But they cannot imitate events. The only thing that language can imitate is language. Words can only imitate words. The only imitation, mimesis, possible in literature is the imitation of words, where the exact words uttered can be repeated, reproduced, imitated. Otherwise, all narratives are narratives of events. All narratives are usually narrative of events. Sometimes it's a narrative of words, and then if they are word for words, it will be like a complete imitation of the words that were spoken originally. All narratives are narratives of events, and here every narrative chooses to take a certain amount of distance from the information or from the events or from the words that are narrated. So he gives a distinction between the narrative of words and the narrative of events. Let's start with the narrative of events. A narrative of events is always a diegesis. It always proceeds by narration. That is, which means that a narrative of events is a transcription of the non-verbal into the verbal. A transcription of the non-verbal into the verbal. And basically here there is a very easy and very useful formula that Gérard Genet gives to define mimesis and diegesis. From this perspective, he says, we can define mimesis as a maximum of information and a minimum of the informer, right? A maximum of the information, meaning the narrative gives you as much as information, but the informer becomes transparent because he wants to show you, right? The informer, the narrator, wants to be transparent. I'll just tell you what happens, you know? I won't tell you what happens from my perspective, how I think about it. I'll try to give you what happens, right? So you can only achieve a degree of imitation here by making yourself transparent, by making yourself disappear from the story. It's not about me, it's about the events. And he defines diegesis as maximum of information, a minimum of information and a maximum presence of the informer. Meaning that a narration has a lot of informer because this is the story I will tell you. So it's my perspective, my recollection, my memories, my feelings, right? Me, the person who is telling you the story. There is a maximum presence of the narrative instance, the narrator, and there is a minimum amount of information, the events that are being narrated. So mimesis involves maximum of information, minimum of the informer. And diegesis involves a minimum of information and a maximum presence of the informer. As far as the narrative of words is concerned, Genet says that the only form of mimesis, that narrative of words is the only form of mimesis that's like possible, that's truly possible. The only thing words can imitate are other words. And he says but a narrative of words, sometimes it imitates words, sometimes it reports the words. When I report the words of my colleague in my own words, I use indirect speech, right? I am narrating his words. But if I report his words as my friend spoke them, right? As he spoke them, the exact same words, right? That is a degree of imitation is involved. So Genet says there is 3 types of narrative of words. There is narrated speech, and it's the most distant and reduced. Basically, somebody says something, and I report it. I report it as a narrated speech. So-and-so said that, right? Like I'm using the reported speech. That's the narrated speech. A novel sometimes does that. A novel proceeds using narrated speech, right? And they report words of someone in reported speech. The second narrative of words, he calls it transposed words. And here, it's a question when the narrator mixes his own words with the words of the character, right? They blend and mix. That's transposed words. For example, I told my mother that I absolutely had to marry Albertine, right? I told my mother that I absolutely had to marry Albertine. Is that what I exactly said? No. Probably what I said was, 20 minutes conversation. And mulakhas, the summary of that 20 minutes conversation is, I told my mother that I absolutely had to marry Albertine. It's a reported speech in which the words of the person who spoke and my words as the narrator blend together. You can't tell whose words are where. The third is the reproduced speech. And here, this is the most mimetic form because the words are reported exactly as they were spoken, right? And direct speech is used. It's not narrated or reported speech, it's the direct speech is reported. So there is 3 levels of the narrative of words. There is the narrative of words using direct speech. There is the narrative of words using reported speech. He said that, blah, blah, blah. There is the narrative of words using transposed speech, in which the reported words and the words of the narrator blend together. That's as far as distance is concerned. So you can ask, what's the distance of the narrator from what's being narrated? Is the narrator narrating events or words? Is the narrator narrating events, right, with the maximum of information and a minimum of informer, trying to create the illusion of mimesis? Or is the narrator reporting the events with a minimum of information and a maximum of informer, and thereby producing by diegesis? Narrative of words has 3 types: the narrated speech, the transposed speech, and the reproduced speech. After distance, there is the question of perspective, and it's the second mode of regulating information. Traditional criticism, says Genet, confuses two different issues under the question of point of view. In the past, traditional criticism used the category of point of view. When you study literature, you study character, setting, and point of view. Well, under point of view, Genet says, we confuse two things. We confuse the question who sees and the question who speaks. The question who sees the information, through whose eyes is the information coming to us, who witnesses it, who is doing the seeing, right? This, Gérard Genet says, is a question of focalization. He calls it focalization. The question of who speaks is a question of voice. It's the question of who is speaking, who is narrating the events to us. So let's start first with focalization, the question who sees. Genet argues that a distinction should be made between narrative voice, the question who speaks, and narrative perspective, the question who sees. The one who perceives and sees the event is not necessarily the person or the character who tells the story of those events. And vice versa, the person who tells the story is not necessarily the person who saw and witnessed and perceived the events. There are three kinds of focalization. The question who sees in terms of perception, seeing and witnessing. There are three kinds of focalization according to Gérard Genet. First, there is zero focalization. Here, the narrator is an omniscient narrator. The narrator has no restrictions. The narrator knows what's in this character's head, what's in this character's heart, what's happening in this house, what's happening in the city over there, what's happening in the other country. There is no limit on how much the narrator can see, right? The narrator can see anything they want. So that's why Genet calls it zero focalization, because there is no limit. The narrator is omniscient. It's like someone who can see and hear everything. The second type of focalization is called internal focalization. And here, the narrator knows only as much as the character knows, right? So if I tell you the story of John, and John, it's the story of what happens to John, and me as the narrator, I only tell you the things that John sees, feels, and hears. That's it, nothing else. I can't tell you what's in the other city because John isn't there. It's like I have a camera and it's only focused on John, and logically I cannot see anything else. So the narrator knows as much as the focal character. This character filters the information provided to the reader. And the narrator does not and cannot access or report the thoughts of other characters. Focalization means primarily a limitation, a restriction, a limit on the capacity of the narrator to see and report. If the narrator wants to be seen as reliable, he or she has to recognize and respect that he or she cannot be everywhere and cannot know everything, right? So more serious narratives accept this fact. But traditional classical narratives usually give you an omniscient narrator who knows everything, knows what's inside people, knows what's inside their homes, what's in the other town, and so on and so forth. The third type of focalization is called external focalization. Here the narrator knows less than the character. He acts a bit like a camera lens. So if, again, we go back to the example of John, if I give you the example of John, me, the narrator, can only see the outside of John. I cannot know what John is thinking. I cannot tell what John is feeling inside, but I can see his facial expressions. I can tell you what John is doing, but I have no capability of knowing what's inside him. The third and last aspect of narrative that Janet investigates are the levels of narration, or the question, who speaks? Who is speaking in the story? Sometimes you find there is two levels of narration. Basically, Janet systematizes the varieties of narrators according to a purely formal criteria. Before that, people spoke about the narrator and they confused the narrator with the author and the hero, right? So the narrator is neither the author nor the hero, right? But it's a narrative instance. Who is telling us the events that we are reading about? So using this criteria, Janet comes up with a fourfold distinction of the narrative voice or the narrative instance. Of course, you should note that you should not confuse in fiction the narrating instance, the character who is doing the narration, with the instance of writing. The writer is separate from the narrator. And also it should not be confused with the fictional character, with the real author, or the fictional recipient, receiver, addressee of the fictive narrative of the real reader with the real reader of the work. So we can't confuse the recipient. For example, if I tell you a story in which I was telling a story to my nephew, who is the recipient of my story there? It's my nephew, it's not you. You just get it by extension. But the audience of my narrative was my nephew. From the point of view of time, there are three types of narrating instances. Three types. What Janet calls first subsequent narration, and this is the classical, old-fashioned, traditional mode. It's a position, it has a position of the past narrative. So the narrative instance is here today, and the events happened in the past. There is a narrative instance prior, predictive narrative. It's called predictive narrative. Generally, in the future tense, it dreams, and it has dreams and prophecies. This type of narrating is done with less frequency than any other. There is simultaneous narrative, and here the narrative is the present contemporaneous with the action, right? So this is like instances when the story is happening as we are seeing it on TV or as we are reading it in the novel. The character speaks in the present. I am seeing, I got there, I am talking to so-and-so right now. And of course, there is the interpolated, which is very rare and very complex. And it's a narrative that happens, it's interpolated. It happens between moments of action. The best example of the interpolated is the epistolary novel, or the novel of letters, right? Where letters go back and forth, and in between there is narration. Janet also divides four types or four levels of narration. There is the homodiegetic narrator, and this is a story in which the narrator is present in the story he narrates. The narrator is present in the story he narrates as a character, one of the characters. There is a heterodiegetic narrator. You find the story in which the narrator is absent from the story. The narrator, his function is just to tell us the story, but he is not a character in the story itself. It's called heterodiegetic narrator. There is the extradiegetic narrative. The narrator is superior in the sense of being at least one level higher than the story world, and hence has a good or virtually complete knowledge of the story he narrates. For example, I tell you a story about my nephew telling a story to his nephew, right? So my possession, there is the story that my nephew is telling to his nephew, right? That's one level of narration. And above it, there is the story of me telling you the story of my nephew telling the story of his nephew. There is levels of narration, right? And that basically is the third and last part of the narrative discourse. Basically, Janet looks at three aspects: order, perspective, and levels, and voice. Some very important distinctions here. Pay attention to them, especially questions of voice and focalization, who speaks and who hears. For more information, you can find some references on the PowerPoint that will be posted online soon, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you very soon again, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.